is part of a larger grant project that I'm working on with two of my American colleagues, Dr. Kirsten Weber and Dr. Sophia Zaher. And what we're looking at is Black Lives Matter discourse and hashtag conversations on Instagram that's been funded by a research cultivation grant from the National Communication Association. And the goals of this project are basically to help understand the spread of social movements through digital platforms, and particularly in the case of Black Lives Matter, looking at how public discourse around race might be shifting in a productive way through hashtag activism, but also how movements are spreading across national boundaries and across platforms. And one of the innovations that our grant project makes into the study of hashtag activism is that it focuses predominantly on engagement through Instagram, which has so far received far less scholarly attention in terms of its political potential, even as the popularity of the platform continues to grow. So the study that I'm going to share with you today is one of the sub-projects that we're working on Aboriginal Lives Matter, which I've been working on with the help of two research assistants, Jeff Miller here at UTS and Marnie Lawrence at Central Michigan University. And we're exploring this hashtag as an example of how activism, conversation, and discourse around racial justice has spread internationally, particularly outside of the US context. So one of the foundations for this study is the concept of connective action by Lance Bennett and Alex Sigerberg. It's been really influential in research on the spread and organization of digital social movements. And this idea of connective action came from studying movements like Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring, which are characterized as large protest movements that scale up quickly and are flexible in tracking moving political targets, primarily because these movements enable the personalization of collective action messages and because of the digitally mediated forms of communication that become possible through social networking sites. So we study this in relation to the hashtag Aboriginal Lives Matter as an Australian-focused faction of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we're interested in looking at both the internationalization of this faction as well as the limits of this kind of connective action, particularly as it relates to discussions about race and racism, which are deeply socially and historically contextual. And so I want to begin by talking about our use of the hashtag Aboriginal Lives Matter as the search term, which was the basis for this study. In our exploratory research, we found that this hashtag was being widely used in Australia to draw attention to the state-sanctioned brutality faced by Indigenous Australians. At the same time, we note that the hashtag itself is quite problematic. There's this simple substitution of Black for Aboriginal as hashtag shorthand that both excludes Torres Strait Islanders. It's a term implicated with Australia's explicitly racist historical relations with the country's First Nations people. On the other hand, alternative terms like Indigenous Lives Matter were used, but when they were indexed as hashtag conversations on the digital platform, they tended to lose the specificity of the Australian context. So we take this issue on board. I mean, I guess noting that the focus on this term has inevitably shaped the posts and actors that this study is based on, and is useful to think about as part of larger conversations around language and identity politics and digital platforms. So we based this study on a sample of posts that we acquired from Instagram using CrowdTangle and the search term Aboriginal Lives Matter. And we were looking at posts that were published between the 1st and the 30th of June 2020, which was the date range that coincided with the popular Blackout Tuesday Instagram action, as well as the wave of Black Lives Matter protests that took place in Australia around this time. And so we ended up with a total of around 900 posts. After sorting and cleaning the data, we ended up with about 600 posts for our analysis. And our first research goal was basically to start off by mapping this movement in terms of who was engaging in this online conversation. So we coded these posts to determine the demographic composition of participants. We sorted them into 5 main categories: celebrities, politicians, and government organizations, media, for-profit organizations, and nonprofits. And we also coded for the gender and race of accounts where they were linked to individuals. And what we found, which is what you can see on screen, is that the conversation was largely dominated by celebrities. This category included actors, sports people, musicians, and digital influencers. And they produced 57% of the sample of posts. Media accounts, for-profit businesses, and nonprofits all were kind of similar in range, between 10 and 14%. politicians and government organizations were fairly poorly represented. And again, there's some messiness in these categories. Some of the media accounts that were classified as media were non-profit media organizations. Some influencers could arguably be classified as for-profit businesses, but we find that these general trends seem to hold. And what we found most interesting about this result is that it challenges the notion that this hashtag is evidence of a grassroots or an activist-driven conversation, because the main contributors are individuals who already have established and influential social platforms and whose participation is likely to be linked, at least in some ways, to the commercial valuing of their brands. So we would suggest that this hashtag was operating quite differently than in the US, where the Black Lives Matter hashtag originated as a form of citizen journalism that operated very clearly as a networked counterpublic, and where activists were given prominence within these digital conversations. And, you know, there's a lot of potential reasons for this. The data that we've collected obviously isn't directly comparable to the Black Lives Matter data and findings that have been collected over the past years. But it does seem to signal that the prominence of this iteration of Aboriginal Lives Matter conversation takes place at a time where mainstream media attention to Black Lives Matter is relatively high, which likely skews the kinds of actors involved, especially in a trend-driven digital landscape where silence is treated as complicity or ignorance. Or as you can see in the proportion of media outlets that covered this story, this content seems to acknowledge that this is an issue that's worthy of attention, but stops short of producing content that suggests avenues for radical action or change. In terms of gender and race, the categorizations were based on the self-presentation and self-identification on accounts. We found that female identified posters produced the majority of posts, with about 40% of the total sample. Male identified posters produced 15%, and non-binary individuals producing 1%. We also found that this conversation overwhelmingly dominated by non-Indigenous posters, with Indigenous identified and Black identified individuals producing 6% and 5% of the total sample respectively. So again, there's some interesting contrast to be drawn to the general trends and findings that have been made about the Black Lives Matter movement, where Black males have been found by a number of studies to have historically dominated this conversation on Twitter. And, you know, the gender breakdown might be due to the demographics of Instagram, where in Australia and the US, women are significantly more active users than men. The fact that so few of the posters were Indigenous Australians ties into some of my earlier points about this conversation being derivative of rather than producing racial justice activism. As you can see that this hashtag in Australia isn't really being used to express individual experiences and the personalization of politics that has been found to be most effective in producing engagement and support for other hashtag activist movements like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. So my team and I explored these ideas a bit further by running a qualitative analysis to identify the main themes that were emerging from within this conversation. And we're still working on refining some of these findings, but the key points that I just want to point out to you tonight are around references to the US Black Lives Matter movement, its integration with the language and strategies of Instagram, and the kinds of actions and solutions that have been recommended. And on the next few slides, I'll show you some of the quotes from the sample to illustrate what we're seeing. So across the sample, there are a lot of direct references to the United States and the US-based Black Lives Matter movement. This takes a few different forms. Some of them encourage solidarity with the US Black Lives Matter movement. Others see this as an opportunity to examine parallels to the systemic racism in Australia, and others go further in making accusations of hypocrisy that Australians are demonstrating concern for Black Lives Matter without adequately reflecting on the racism in our own backyard. That was a phrase that was commonly used. And these references show to some extent that the legibility of this conversation is highly dependent on the logics of the Black Lives Matter movement, which again is very intimately tied to the events and history of the United States. And this can be limiting, both because it tended to reduce the discussion, the potential for discussion around racism in Australia to an important but a single issue, which is the number of Indigenous deaths in custody. but also because more broadly, it makes the visibility of conversation about race in Australia heavily dependent on its relative visibility in the United States. When we looked at the kinds of discourse being used in this conversation, we found a lot of platform influence in the kinds of language being used, which included a lot of aspirational but ultimately empty messages of solidarity and support being circulated, and even the same phrases being used over and over again, like that first one that you see on screen there. So on the one hand, this is reflective of the extent to which discussions of race in a post-racial context have been almost entirely absent. And this seems to explain why so many individuals that were posting demonstrated so much discomfort and hesitation in their language. But more broadly, we also observe this conflation between the language of activism and the branding strategies that are crucial to success on Instagram, including language like amplifying and muting content, or the movement Share the Mic, which was quite popular in Australia, which again tends to focus racial activism on individuals and individual actions. Often there was a large call to amplify the accounts of Black and Indigenous creatives and businesses, or to temporarily give voice and visibility to select Black and Indigenous individuals, which is what Share the Mic was kind of about. And these actions are, obviously productive in one way, but tend to obscure the structural and ideological problems at the root of contemporary racism. There's no sense of collective action within these kinds of behaviors. And so in discussing actions, we want to think more generally about how activism is envisaged in these kinds of conversations. And we found that a lot of posts, the majority of posts, didn't promote any particular action or solution. But when they did, they tended to focus on market actions and neoliberal individualism as conduits to change. These are the actions that included donating money to businesses and campaigns, being educated or informed, or as I mentioned above, performing this kind of Instagram activism by making particular accounts or brands visible on social media as forms of activism in and of themselves. And these actions overwhelmingly replace calls for traditional civic actions like voting or calling representatives and protesting or signing petitions. So we don't want to set up a false binary about certain types of activism being more legitimate or productive than others, but we did see this as significant in the ways that both Instagram as a platform culture and the broadening of this movement have directed conversation and attention to activism for this particular hashtag in a very particular way. And just briefly, in summary, we think these findings are important in looking at the ways that engagement with social media and engagement with social justice movements do and don't overlap, and how this distinction becomes much more important as the most successful hashtag activism movements continue to grow and gain mainstream visibility. Thank you.